So we're sending a sign up request, and that's great. And we got many other requests to send. But before we do so, let's actually improve our setup here a little bit. At the moment, we're sending this request, but there are two things which I'm not liking. For one, we're not letting the user know that something is happening. Now, of course, our application here is super fast because it's all running locally on our machine. So the moment we press login or sign up here, the request gets sent and it only takes milliseconds to complete. This will probably take a bit longer once you really deployed this to a real server and the distance between the user and your code is a bit further. So it would be nice to show some loading spinner, some indicator to the user that something is happening. In addition to that, what if an error occurs? For example, if I switch to sign up here and I hack myself into a wrong form submission by inspecting my content and then manually removing the disabled attribute, now the button is enabled and any user can do that. Of course, this is not a security issue, you're only hacking yourself. But if you do that, nonetheless, you are able to, for example, enter invalid data here. So if I re-enable this, I can press sign up here. And of course, we do get back an error. We can see it here in the log. Our backend validation works. And this is the reason why we do have backend validation, by the way, because front-end validation can be disabled by the user. But still, it's not a great user experience that it still continues and we show no error message. The same, by the way, if we would try to sign up with a user who already exists. In that scenario, we also don't really handle an error. So on the backend, we got some security mechanisms in place. For signing up, we're validating input. And in the sign up controller, when we create a user, we also check whether that user already exists. But at the moment, we're not really taking advantage of this on the front end. We're not giving the user a great feedback, neither for a loading state nor for an error state. So let's change both now. And to change both, in my auth page on the front end, I in the end want to handle, well, two different states, the loading and the error state. So here we already import use state, and with that we can set up new states here in our auth function, our auth component. We have, let's say, is loading and set is loading here. And initially we're not loading, so I start in a false state. And I also have an error and let's say a set error state and function here. And initially we have no error, so this is undefined. Now we can use these two states to kind of update our UI. So here, when we start sending the request, before we send it, I of course want to set is loading to true, for example, because now I am loading and I want the UI to re-render here. Since this here is an async function and therefore all wrapped in a promise, React will also go ahead and immediately update the UI and not batch multiple state updates, for example, state updates that come later together. Instead, it will do this right away because it detects that this is asynchronous and there will be some time between this state update and potential future state updates. So here I set is loading to true. Now we can also, of course, set our error to null here and make sure it is reset, but we don't really need to do that. We should handle that differently. So let's just set is loading to true. Now, once we got our response, I of course want to set is loading to false again. And no matter if we got a response or an error, loading is definitely done. So at this point here, I want to set is loading to false. Now, if we do have an error, however, I want to call set error and set this to, let's say, error message. It's up to you what you want here, if you want to set this to a more complex object or if your error should really just be a message which you expect to get here. We can also provide a fallback in case a message property does not exist, where we just say something went wrong, please try again. We shouldn't really need that though, because on the back end we already have error handling in place, which always in the end gives us a fallback error message. Nonetheless, this doesn't hurt, so we now got this set up here and we're either setting our error state or we're setting the loading state. Now this login thing, I only want to call off login if we didn't have an error. So only here in the try block. And therefore I actually want to set this loading to false here and here separately. Otherwise I would set it to false after we already changed the context and probably redirect it. So make sure to first clear your local state on this page before you trigger something that might change the component that's loaded. Otherwise we might be updating a state on a component which is not on the screen anymore. So now we have a loading state and we have some error state. Now, of course, we want to take advantage of these new states. And for that attached, you find two new components in the components zip file, which you can drag and drop into your components UI elements folder. That's the loading spinner and the error modal. The loading spinner also has its own CSS file, the error modal doesn't. Now, these are components which do just what the names imply. They render a loading spinner, or they utilize our existing modal. So make sure this import path fits your structure and it points at your modal component file. So they render a modal which shows an error message or a loading spinner. Now, with these added back in auth page in the auth component here, let's import those components. So I will import the error modal here from shared components, UI elements, error modal, and of course do the same for the loading spinner, which I import from shared components, UI elements, loading spinner. These two new components help us use our new states we're managing, the isLoading and the error state. Let's maybe start with the isLoading state. Here, inside of this card, I will add a dynamic element where I check isLoading, and if this is true, I want to render the loading spinner, and there, important, add the as overlay prop just like this. You could set it to true, but this is not required. It's true by default if you add it like this. And this in the end will just impact how exactly this loading spinner is loaded. You can check out the loading spinner logic and CSS styles to understand what exactly this does. And with that, if we save this, let's give it a try. Let's go back here, switch to sign up, and enter some credentials here. Click on sign up, and now we see a loading spinner and we are redirected. Please also note, however, that I actually got an error here. So I don't want to be redirected. I got an error and still I was redirected. Now that's something we'll have to handle in the next lecture. We're not showing our error modal, but even worse than that, we were redirected, as I just said, and this is definitely not what we want.